Hey, faithful listeners, this is your host, Jen, with the Bible Explained podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning. We're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 10 and talking about King Jehu and some of the crazy things that he ends up doing now that he's become king. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. All right, faithful listeners. Well, I hope you had a really good weekend. I did. I had a very good weekend, actually. But last week was kind of rough for a second there because the pump in my basement died, which meant I couldn't do any laundry. So my poor husband and I were like trying to save the last few clean outfits that we have so that we don't have to like hand wash everything and dry it out in the backyard. Well, actually, I could have used my dryer. But I would have had to hand wash everything like in my bathtub. And I was like, yeah, I'm not about that life. But we got it fixed and everything's all good now. And my laundry currently is going through its cycle so that we can get up to date with all of our clean laundry. But I hope you guys had a good week and that the weather was okay for you. I heard there were some nasty storms down south. So I hope everybody stayed safe throughout all of that. And of course, if you ever have a prayer request, please don't hesitate to reach out. You'll find my contact information listed in the description of this episode, and I will write you down in my little prayer journal for the week. But today, let's go ahead and read 2 Kings 10, 1 through 17. I'll be reading this from the WEB version. Please feel free to grab the version of the Bible that you prefer this morning, and also your cup of coffee. Once again, this is 2 Kings 10, 1 through 17. Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria to the rulers of Jezreel, even to the elders, and to those who brought up Ahab's sons, saying, Now as soon as this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses and a fortified city also, and armor, select the best and fittest of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. But they were exceedingly afraid, and said, Behold, the 2 kings didn't stand before him. How then shall we stand? He who is over the household, and who is over the city, the elders also, and those who raise the children, sent to Jehu, saying, We are your servants, and we will do all that you ask us. We will not make any man king. You do that which is good in your eyes. Then he wrote a letter the second time to them, saying, If you are on my side, then you will listen to my voice. Take the heads of the men who are of your master's sons, and come to me to Jezreel by tomorrow this time. Now the king's sons, being 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who brought them up. When the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and killed them, even 70 people, and put their heads in baskets, and sent them to him to Jezreel. The messenger came and told him, They have brought the heads of the king's sons. He said, Lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until the morning. In the morning he went out and stood and said to all the people, You are righteous. Behold, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these? You know now that nothing will fall to the earth of Yahweh's word, which Yahweh spoke concerning Ahab's house. For Yahweh has done that which he has spoken by his servant Elijah. So Jehu struck all that remained of Ahab's house in Jezreel, with all his great men, his familiar friends, and his priests, until he left him no one remaining. He arose and departed and went to Samaria. As he was at the shearing house of the shepherds on the way, Jehu met with the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, Who are you? They answered, We are the brothers of Ahaziah. We are going down to greet the children of the king and the children of the queen. He said, Take them alive. They took them alive and killed them at the pit of the shearing house, even 42 men. He didn't leave any of them. When he had departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. He greeted him and said to him, Is your heart right, as my heart is with your heart? Jehonadab answered, It is. If it is, give me your hand. He gave him his hand, and he took him up into the chariot. And he said, Come with me, and see my zeal for Yahweh. So they made him ride in his chariot. When he came to Samaria, he struck all who remained to Ahab in Samaria, until he had destroyed them, according to Yahweh's word, which he spoke to Elijah. So hopefully you remember where we left off last time. Jehu was the new king of Israel. He has been anointed by God to become the next king. And with that anointing came the responsibility of enacting God's judgment onto Ahab's entire family. And the reason God wanted to judge Ahab's family was because of what happened in 1 Kings 21. And I'm going to read that again. This is from the WEB. This was when the prophet Elijah was still alive, and Ahab was obviously still alive. And so Elijah goes to Ahab and says to him, I have found you because you have sold yourself to do that which is evil in Yahweh's sight. Behold, I will bring evil on you and will utterly sweep you away and will cut off from Ahab everyone who urinates against a wall, and him who is shut up and him who is left at large in Israel. I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the provocation with which you have provoked me to anger and have made Israel to sin. Yahweh also spoke of Jezebel, saying, the dogs will eat Jezebel by the rampart of Jezreel. The dogs will eat he who dies of Ahab in the city, and the birds of the sky will eat he who dies in the field. And this is because Ahab and Jezebel, the king and queen of Israel, were absolutely horrible leaders. They caused Israel to sin through Baal worship and the grotesque way that Baal worship was done. They also killed Yahweh followers, and specifically the prophets of Yahweh had to go into hiding, and hardly any of them were left alive. In fact, Yahweh worship was almost wiped out in Israel during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. And then, to make matters worse, Ahab and Jezebel killed a man named Naboth for his property because they wanted it as a vegetable garden, but Naboth wouldn't sell it to them because he wanted to keep it in the family, and he believed that he was doing the right thing by not selling it to Ahab and Jezebel. So Jezebel goes out and cooks up this scheme to actually kill Naboth, and also Naboth's entire family, his lineage, all the sons that would have inherited the rights to his property. And it was a successful scheme. Naboth and his entire family died because Ahab wanted his property. So that was the last straw, and finally God sends Elijah to Ahab to pronounce this judgment on him. So now this judgment is coming true in 2 Kings chapter 10 with Jehu. In the last chapter, Jehu successfully killed King Jehoram, who was Ahab's son, and also Queen Jezebel. And he also killed King Ahaziah of Judah, because King Ahaziah of Judah was related actually to Ahab. He was the grandson of King Ahab. So Jehu killed 3 prominent people in the last chapter. So now Jehu needs to go into Samaria to get to the rest of Ahab's sons. Apparently Ahab had 70 sons that lived in the capital city of Samaria. But Samaria was not an easy location to go to because Samaria was the capital city of Israel, and so it was a fortified city. It was where all the weapons were. It was where all the chariots and the horses and the armor was. And so Ahab's sons would have had access to all of that weaponry. So Jehu and his men couldn't just walk into Samaria very easily. So this is what Jehu does. It says that Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, so Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of Jezreel, even the elders, and to those who brought up Ahab's sons, saying, as soon as this letter comes to you, since your master's sons are with you, and you have chariots and horses, and the fortified city also, and armor, select the best and fittest of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. So basically, Jehu proposes a duel between himself and one of Ahab's other sons. And actually, this is in line with something we find from the Old Testament law in Numbers chapter 35, where it talks about the avenger of blood. That's kind of what Jehu is doing here. Because Jehu has killed members of Ahab's family, according to the laws at the time, an avenger of blood could try to kill Jehu. And typically an avenger of blood would be somebody within the family of the person who was killed. And that's kind of what Jehu is proposing here. He writes these letters to all of the elders, and he says, put somebody on the throne, put the avenger of blood on the throne, and let that person fight me face to face, and we will see who the better man is. And that would be Jehu's way of being able to easily get into Samaria, was if a duel was proposed. Then he could basically walk right in, and then whoever won the duel, which Jehu apparently was very convinced that he would win, whoever won then could have all of his men kill the other side's men. But what ends up happening is when the elders and the leaders of that city receive this letter of Jehu's, they become terrified. And they say, behold, 2 kings couldn't stand before Jehu. How then shall we stand? So the people quickly write a letter back to Jehu. And they say, we're your servants. We will do everything that you ask us to do. We will not put somebody on the throne. We don't care about Ahab's children. You do what you want to do. You can walk right into Samaria if you want to. So Jehu receives this letter, and he writes a second letter to them. And he says, okay, if you guys are on my side like you claim to be, then kill all of Ahab's sons that remain and send their heads to me in a basket. I'll be waiting for them here in Jezreel. And the people comply. It says in verse 6, now the king's sons, being 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who brought them up. When the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and killed them, even 70 people, and put their heads in baskets and sent them to Jezreel. A messenger came and told him, they have brought the heads of the king's sons. And you might be like, holy moly, that is super grotesque. And yeah, it is. This was something apparently that was very commonly done back in these days, was to display the heads of the person that you killed, because not only was it a great dishonor to the person's body, but it was also demoralizing to anybody who might try to challenge the murderer. And that is why throughout history, heads were displayed after the body was killed and then beheaded. So this was a common tactic done. And so Jehu, who is quite the person addicted to war, as you can see in the stories that we see of him, he displays the heads right outside of the city gates. And in the morning, the people are gathered around to look at all of the heads of the kings, and they're feeling an intense sense of guilt over what they have done. But Jehu stands out there and he gives them a pep rally. And he says, you are all righteous. This was a good thing that you did. Behold, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all of these? So in other words, he's like, look, you guys were acting righteously because this is within Yahweh's will. Jehu didn't even have to go into Samaria and have a full-fledged battle like he initially thought he'd have to. Instead, the leaders actually listened to him and killed all of Ahab's remaining sons. And Jehu didn't even have to lift a finger. So he says this was God's will. This was God's judgment being brought down on Ahab's entire family. So don't be demoralized by this and don't feel guilty of it because it was within God's will. He says in verse 10, know now that nothing will fall to the earth of Yahweh's word, which Yahweh spoke concerning Ahab's house. For Yahweh has done that which he spoke by his servant Elijah, which is again what we read in 1 Kings chapter 21, where God did tell Ahab that he was going to pronounce judgment on Ahab's house because of what Ahab had done. But then after this, in verse 11, it says, Jehu struck all that remained of Ahab's house in Jezreel, with all his great men, his familiar friends, and his priests, until he left no one remaining. So this means that Jehu went on a rampage after this. Even though he is effectively won in every single way he could win the throne, he is won. He still decided to go into Jezreel and kill anybody who might have ties to Ahab. And this included all of Ahab's friends, all of the great men that possibly advised Ahab, or elders that were associated with Ahab, probably also King Jehoram's family that remained, and also the priests of Ahab and any advisors that he had. They were all gone. He left no one remaining, is what it says in Jezreel. And then in verse 12, it says he arose and departed and went to Samaria, and as he was at the shearing house of the shepherds on the way, Jehu met with the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and said, who are you? And they answered, we're the brothers of Ahaziah. We are going down to greet the children of the king and the children of the queen. And he says, take them alive. They took them alive and killed them at the pit of the shearing house, even 42 men. He didn't leave any of them alive. And you might be wondering at this point in time, is Jehu going too far? Like, is God actually okay with all of this? Because it says at the end of this chapter, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, that God actually rewards Jehu for his zeal. Okay, here's what it says in verse 30. Yahweh said to Jehu, because you've done well in executing that which is right in my eyes, and have done to Ahab's house according to all that was in my heart, your descendants shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. And you might be like, oh, well, God was okay with all of this, clearly, that Jehu had done. But I think a lot of times people mistake God's silence for God's approval. Because if we turn to Hosea chapter 1, there's an interesting little verse here about King Jehu. So let's go ahead and read this. Hosea 1, starting in verse 3, ending in verse 5. And I'm reading this today out of the NLT version. So Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she became pregnant and gave Hosea a son. And the Lord said, name the child Jezreel, for I am about to punish King Jehu's dynasty to avenge the murders he committed at Jezreel. In fact, I will bring an end to Israel's independence. I will break its military power in the Jezreel Valley. So that's pretty clear that God was not super happy with what Jehu had done in Jezreel. And even though it doesn't specifically say that God was unhappy with Jehu in 2 Kings chapter 10, once again, his silence does not necessarily mean his approval. And you might be like, well, Jen, why did God then bless Jehu at the end of 2 Kings 10 if he wasn't happy with him? Well, I think it goes back to God's mercy. He's very merciful to people. And Jehu did obey God by doling out the judgment on Ahab's family. Like, Jehu clearly did obey. But he went too far. And I think where he went too far was when he went into Jezreel and killed anybody even associated to Ahab. And I believe personally, though scripture does not say this, he probably went too far also when he killed Ahaziah's relatives. And once again, that's in 2 Kings 10, 12 through 14. It says that Jehu met some of the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and asked them, who are you? And they said, we are brothers of Ahaziah. We are going down to greet the children of the king and the children of the queen. And he said, take them alive. And he took them alive and killed them at the pit of the shearing house, even 42 men. And he didn't leave any of them alive. And even though this says that these are Ahaziah's brothers in the WEB, the Hebrew word means more like relatives, not direct siblings, if that makes sense. So these relatives of Ahaziah that had probably traveled a very long distance to meet Jehoram and Queen Jezebel for whatever reason might not have even been directly related to Ahab. And yet Jehu killed all of them. And the first time I read this, I'm like, why are these guys traveling in the middle of like a civil war with Jehu? And it's probably because, news traveled very slowly back in these days because they didn't have newspapers or mail, really, or, cell phones. And so these relatives of Ahaziah probably didn't even know that Jehu was doing all of this. And they just happened to meet Jehu on the way to seeing Ahab. But then again, could it have been providential? Like God planned it that Jehu would meet these men because they also were going to be judged by God? Yes, that is possible, but it does not specifically say that in scripture. So honestly, I don't know if this was providential of God or if Jehu went way too far in his killing spree. But then after this, we meet this guy named Jehonadab, and he's actually kind of a pivotal figure. It says in verse 15, when Jehu had departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. He greeted him and said, is your heart right as my heart is with your heart? And Jehonadab answered, it is. And so we don't know if these two guys were friends before. It kind of seems like they might have been. But Jehonadab was the son of Rechab, and he was the leader of the Rechabites. And the Rechabites are mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 35 as a people who were extremely obedient. God actually used them as an example for obedience. And you can read Jeremiah 35 and learn all about the Rechabites if you're interested in that. But I'm not going to read that today, even though I was going to, just due to time. But the Rechabites were a people that almost kind of lived like an Amish-y nomad lifestyle, it seems like. They abstained from all liquor and wine. They lived in the wilderness in tents. They did not have any permanent living places. They lived in such a way that God would have to supply their every single need. They didn't plant anything. They didn't garden anything. They fully lived off the land and basically asked God to supply all of their needs every single day. And this was a hard lifestyle that these Rechabites lived. But they were so dedicated to their lifestyle and so dedicated to Jehonadab, which we meet here in 2 Kings 10, that they chose to live this very difficult, very plain lifestyle in order to please God. And because of that, God did commend them for their obedience. But Jehonadab is the leader of the Rechabites, and he, it seems like, might have been friends with Jehu. And the reason they were friends was because Jehonadab also was somebody who was very against Baal worship and very against the kind of voguish lifestyle of the kings of Israel as well. So he opposed all of that. And so, of course, he's going to be on Jehu's side because Jehu is reforming Israel in a way by getting rid of all of this. So Jehu gets up into Jehonadab's chariot, and they go to Samaria and strike all who remained to Ahab in Samaria until they were completely destroyed, according to Yahweh's word, which he spoke to Elijah. So Jehu's reign is off to a very bloody start. There is some evidence in scripture that Jehu went too far with enacting God's judgment. A lot of times we see the opposite, actually. When God tells somebody to enact judgment, usually they don't go far enough. Usually they let people go or don't fully carry out the judgment that God asks them to do. Like in the case of King Saul, he obeyed God fully, but went too far on some of his punishments with people who likely did not deserve to be punished in this way. We're going to talk more about Jehu and what he does to the Baal worshippers on Wednesday, and that's going to be a really interesting episode, so I hope you guys tune in then. But guys, if you like this podcast, you got to tell people about it, because word of mouth is still one of the best ways to spread a podcast. I was actually just reading some podcast news yesterday, and it said something like the way that podcasts are spread these days is 80% of the time it's word of mouth. So if you do like the podcast, then please let people know by telling them that the Bible Explained exists. Faithful listeners, have a wonderful rest of your Monday. I hope to see you guys on Wednesday as we'll finish out 2 Kings chapter 10 and talk more about Jehu and his rampage on Baal worship. Until then, happy listening and God bless.